Hello, everybody. My name is Radhika Desai. I teach politics at the University of Manitoba, and I'm also very inspired by Dimitri's candidacy and his program and his views and his leadership. And I'm also working on his campaign team. I'm really happy to welcome everybody here to this Winnipeg Zoom meeting we are going to have with Dimitri. I can see we have 26 attendees here, and plus 10 more people who are watching on Facebook. So let me just say a couple of things about this. I really think this leadership contest is actually potentially a historic leadership contest, because I think that if Dimitri wins, we will really be looking at a far more progressive setup in Canadian politics than we've had in decades. So I really thank you for taking an interest. I hope you will tell many other people about it. We have exactly just about 24 hours between now and the deadline for joining the Green Party in order to vote for Dimitri later on. You have to join by the end of day, September the 3rd, Vancouver time, in order to be eligible to vote in the October 3rd election to the Green Party leadership. So that's a very important piece of information I'd like to convey. So basically what we are going to do today is, after I lay down some of the house rules, I'm going to hand over to David Kattenberg, who is going to be interviewing Dimitri. Dimitri does not know the questions, so you're going to see a spontaneous live event. And this will take about, David and Dimitri will take about 20 odd minutes for their interview and conversation. And then we are going to open it up to the floor for questions and answers. There will be 3 different sources of Q&A, the chat box, the Q&A box, as well as Facebook. So please feel free to contribute questions to any of them. We've got people, Glenn and Paul, Glenn Michaelchuk and Paul Graham are going to be monitoring these questions, and they will then be putting your questions to Dimitri as they get them. So feel free to put in your questions. Obviously, we hope that everybody maintains decorum and civility and reasonable debate. Some of you may have very strong views, but it's important to express them in a way that is respectful to everybody else, to Dimitri, to everybody else who is listening, and so on. So I think that's about it. As we go on, I'm going to put in some information about where to join from, which website to join at, and which where to find more information about Dimitri and his campaign. But for now, I'm just going to hand over to David. David, take it away.
Thank you so much, Radhika. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello, Dimitri.
David, how are you doing? It's a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm looking forward to you applying your professional journalism skills to my campaign.
Now, full disclosure here, Dimitri and I are brothers. You can tell from the tops of our heads. Not really, but we're friends and colleagues and comrades in arms. And we're both journalists. But that said, Dimitri these questions are going to be hitting Dimitri totally fresh. And I'm going to ask you, Dimitri, when you answer these questions, try to be concise, because keep yourself to maybe 3 minutes an answer, roughly. We're going to try to limit ourselves to 25 minutes max, just max. So basically going till 8 o'clock. So Dimitri, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell me who you are and where you are, and let's start that way.
Well, I'm on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, what is now known as Old Montreal, and I would like to acknowledge the Kanien'kehá:ka people as the traditional custodians of this land, and I'm privileged now to be able to live here. And I am by profession a lawyer, but as you mentioned, David, I've spent probably 8 to 9 years now doing independent journalism for an organization called The Real News. I've also reported for some other independent media organizations, but mostly for The Real News, and focusing on the climate crisis, human rights, foreign policy, and economic matters. And I'm also an activist, and I'm going through an interesting transition in this campaign from being somebody who oftentimes employed tactics of peaceful disruption in order to bring to the public's attention or draw attention to an injustice, to communicating in a political environment, which is a very different context in which to advocate. But it's not unlike what I've done for a lawyer for so long, because in the courtroom, especially in this country, one is expected to maintain a very, very high degree of civility and to maintain a faithful adherence to the facts and the law. And so I find that those experiences and that training is really sort of helping me to navigate the waters of a political contest. I'm an eco-socialist, last thing I'll say, but at the same time, I understand the importance of focusing in these types of discussions on policy and how that is going to have a concrete impacts on people's lives. That's what people want to know. How is your program going to affect them, affect their children, affect future generations? And that's what I look forward to talking to you about tonight.
Dimitri, the title of this webinar suggests that there is a connection between international humanitarian and human rights law on the one hand, like, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Fourth Geneva Convention, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right? All these instruments of international humanitarian human rights law on one hand, and environmental law on the other. That justice and the rule of law in strictly human affairs, the sort of law that you've done, is linked perhaps to justice for the planet. So justice for humanity, justice for the planet. Is there such a connection in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. They're intimately intertwined, these subjects. So so to give you one simple aspect of this interconnection, very clear connection, and that is that in order for us to solve the climate emergency, I mean, greenhouse gas emissions don't stay within borders, and the policies that are being pursued and those that are being neglected, those indispensable policies that are being neglected, will not actually, the policies that are resulting in the climate emergency are ultimately a function of instability and tension and the lack of international cooperation. And in order for us to implement the changes we need in order to make, to resolve the climate emergency, we are going to have to achieve unprecedented levels of cooperation internationally. And the tensions that exist in the world today and that are being exacerbated by things like militarism and inequality and oppression and the American government's project of global hegemony, these things are an impediment to the level of cooperation that we need internationally in order to resolve the climate emergency. And not just the climate emergency, but also the dire threat that is posed by the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Again, we need to have international cooperation. And we have the militaries of the world, which themselves have a direct and enormous carbon footprint. So unless we rein them in and rein in militarism generally, we are not going to be able to deal effectively with the climate crisis. So this is just one of the ways in which the question of international law and productive, peaceful relations between states is intimately intertwined with the climate emergency.
And I'm wondering, where does economic justice fit in, right? I mean, capitalism seems to be fundamentally lawless. I think this is your position.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you envision as the legislative agenda that the Greens should be proposing to rein in the fundamentally lawless practices of Canadian capitalism and global capitalism.
Well, what we have is basically a system which richly rewards those who are both determined and able to externalize the cost of their production. And those persons then, having accumulated vast amounts of wealth at the expense of the broader public by foisting upon us the cost of their production while retaining the profits, use their extreme wealth in order to impede the kinds of dramatic changes we need in order to preserve the livability of our planet and to have a socially just society. So ultimately, we cannot resolve the climate emergency unless we deal with the problem of extreme wealth, oppression, and inequality. It's simply not going to happen. And I think this is something that has been argued quite eloquently by Naomi Klein. if you haven't read her book, This Changes Everything, I urge you to do that, because I think she says it better than I ever could, that this is how we got here. We got here because we have a capitalist system that's run amok, because we aren't dealing fundamentally with the grotesque inequality in our society, which is becoming worse by the day, it seems, and that we have allowed our destiny to be determined by a billionaire class whose greed is unbounded, frankly, and is much more interested in its short-term interest than the long-term health of the planet and of humanity.
So how do we rein capitalism in? Like what specifically, can you think of some specific instruments of legislation that you would propose?
Well, I think first of all, we should have a tax system which prevents the accumulation of extreme wealth. Not just a tax system, but that's one place where we have a lot of work to do. So I've proposed a wealth tax unlike any being proposed by any mainstream political party. Under my proposal, we would cap wealth at $500 million, which is quite a large number, by the way, and arguably it shouldn't be that high. But at $500 million, and any gains in excess of that limit would be taxed at a rate of 100%. And the persons subject to that tax would be taxed on their worldwide assets, not simply those that are in Canada. And if they wanted to avoid the tax, then they would have to abandon residency in Canada and give up their citizenship. Otherwise, they would be subjected to the tax. So in addition, we are proposing a 75% top marginal tax rate, which by historical standards is actually quite low, because in Canada and the United States for much of the post-World War II period, it exceeded 90%. We are proposing an estate tax. We're the only G7 country that doesn't have an estate tax. The one we have proposed is in line with the estate tax in effect in place in France and in other Western European countries. And finally, again, this is not exhaustive, but it's a major part of our tax reform platform. We think that we should end preferential treatment for investment income, because the people who benefit primarily from preferential treatment, tax treatment on investment income, are those who have money to invest. And many Canadians don't. They're living from paycheck to paycheck. So this preferential treatment is one that disproportionately benefits the affluent and accelerates the rate at which they accumulate wealth. So a big part of a big part of the solution, it's not all that we need to do, but a big part of the solution to extreme wealth is substantive, dramatic reform of the tax system.
Is Canada a rule of law country? This has become common coin since Mr. Trudeau came to power in 2015. Trudeau says it, Chrystia Freeland says it, François-Philippe Champagne says it. They all say Canada is a rule of law country. We respect the international legal order. How do you respond to that?
It is not a rule of law country, either domestically or internationally. I mean, it's most obvious on the international stage. So for example, one of the world's most egregious human rights violators is the Saudi autocracy. We're selling deadly weapons to this autocracy, even as it is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Yemen, fomenting terrorism, brutally oppressing women in its own country, brutally oppressing the Shia population in the south of the country. So I could go on and on about the hypocrisies in Canadian government foreign policy and the many ways in which it is flouting the rule of law. I'll give one other example. You know, our country is leading this motley collection of states called the Lima Group, which purports to be determined to restore human rights to the people of Venezuela. And who is a part of the Lima Group? The government of Juan Orlando Hernandez, a dictator who has plunged upwards of 70% of the Honduran population into extreme poverty, and who brazenly stole the election, the last election in Honduras. Also part of the Lima Group is the Colombian government of Ivan Duque. Colombia is the most dangerous country on earth by far for land defenders. And then there's Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian fascist who openly praised the military dictatorship in Brazil. His government is part of the Lima Group. So we are to believe that the Lima Group's real, genuine intention is to ensure human rights and democracy for the people of Venezuela. I mean, to suggest that we are a country that is a champion of the rule of law of international stage should, quite frankly, provoke uproarious laughter from the Ottawa press gallery. If we were looking objectively at Canada's record on the international stage. Domestically, I can tell you from somebody who litigated in the courts of Canada for years that the rule of law is only a reality insofar as you are enabled to be represented by capable legal counsel. If you cannot afford a lawyer, then you cannot realize the dream of equal rights and equal application of the law. And there are in this country millions of people who cannot afford legal counsel. I saw them almost on a daily basis when I was litigating in courts across Canada. You know, they would walk into a courtroom having no idea how to navigate the procedural complexities of the civil courts, and oftentimes begging judges for guidance as to what their rights were. And the judges invariably would decline because they said, you know, we have to maintain our posture as neutral arbiters. So unless you, practically speaking, are able to realize your rights, protect your rights, understand what protections you are entitled to under the law, you don't really have the rule of law.
And Dimitri, you and I know that the Canadian government's official position is and has been for years that Israel's settlements in the West Bank violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Canadian government acknowledges this at its website. It also realizes that settlements constitute a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, therefore a presumptive war crime under the Rome Statute. But on the other hand, the Canadian government does business with the settlements, welcomes settlement products into Canada, extends preferential tariff treatment to them, so on and so forth. And this is, of course, in part subject of this court case that you and I have been involved with. But without getting into all those details, my question to you is, can one really realistically expect a country like Canada to scrupulously abide by its obligations under international law in all cases and situations? I mean, or is it flaky to suggest that a government like Canada should simply abide scrupulously by the law? Or do practical considerations require flexibility?
I don't think it's flaky. I do think it's challenging in the world in which we live, but it's eminently doable. It's absolutely doable. I mean, you know, let's take the case of Israel. What obliges us to actually accord preferential tariff treatment to products made in the settlements, which the government of Canada itself acknowledges to be a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention? There's no obligation on us to do that. We could quite easily say, we're not going to extend the benefits of preferential tariff treatment to products made in the settlements. This is a political choice that the Canadian government is making. You know, one that can easily be undone if the political will were there to do it. You know, where things get really challenging for Canada, and I admit that this is challenging, is that we have an economic relationship with the United States that is so deep and broad that adopting a foreign policy posture or taking positions in international law, which are principled but contrary to the agenda of the United States government, the hegemonic agenda of the United States government, could provoke the ire of the American administration, particularly in the era of Donald Trump. So that's difficult, but nonetheless, we have allies within the United States itself. There are many people who are widely respected within the United States, and I believe their numbers are growing, who have been articulating a principled critique of American foreign policy. Some of them are now entering Congress. Some of them are in the Senate. Although he's not perfect on foreign policy, you have Bernie Sanders setting a new standard for a principled foreign policy relative to American politics. You have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. So we have allies within the United States with whom we need to build bridges, deepen our relationships. We need to communicate always to the American people that we don't view them as the enemy, that they are our brothers and sisters in a collective search for justice and for the preservation of our planet. And we need to go more broadly internationally and develop relationships with like-minded governments around the world to build an alliance of non-belligerent states who are truly committed to peace and to the international rule of law. You know, I think if we do that, it's a long-term struggle, and also we will have to disengage to a significant degree from our deeply intertwined economic relationship with the United States. And we need to diversify our trade relationships, localize to the greatest extent possible the production of the things upon which our citizenry relies for our well-being. I think we can ultimately get to a place where we can be perfectly principled on the international stage while being immunized from the wrath of the American government. But I don't pretend that that's going to be easy, and it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of courage and a lot of persistence.
Let's talk about climate change, the climate change crisis, Dimitri. Various approaches have been put forward to addressing the challenge here in Canada. Carbon tax, fiscal policy, regulations. Where does legislation fit in? Should Canada be enshrining emission reduction targets into the law?
Absolutely. This has to be mandatory. And they should be much more robust emission reduction targets than are currently in place. Our government has adopted the emission reduction targets of Stephen Harper. They were pathetic targets, and we're not even on course to realize those targets. Now, we have to go beyond emission caps. I think we should have a ban on new fossil fuels exploration, all oil and gas exploration. We can't even exploit the resources that we know to exist without wrecking the planet. So why are we allowing companies to go out and to develop new resources, new fossil fuels resources? It makes absolutely no sense. It's economic and environmental insanity. We need to put a ban on the construction of all new fossil fuels infrastructure. And we have to have hard caps, I mentioned, on greenhouse gas emissions declining year over year until we can reach carbon neutrality by, I think it's realistically possible to do it by 2030.
How about enshrining the right to clean air and water and protection of natural ecosystems into Canadian law?
I would be fully supportive of that. And I think we have to set up a civil liability regime which would allow citizens, a direct right of action against corporate actors that are polluting the environment. Right now, we have a pretty sketchy set of environmental laws, much of it that was developed by the common law system over a period of decades, which creates all sorts of hurdles to the imposition of civil liability on polluters by communities that are affected adversely by their activities. So we need to have a robust legal regime that clearly delineates the rights of citizens to seek damages from the corporate sector for the pollution of their environment.
Dimitri, just a couple of more quick, brief questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Do you know Mose Allison, the great jazz blues pianist, now passed away, Mose Allison?
I know you've mentioned Mose to me. I don't know that I've ever heard Mose.
Mose Allison, the great song that he wrote, the great line is, "Everybody's crying justice, just as long as it's business first." So shouldn't business and the economy come first, right? There's folks, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, even the NDP, who think that really, justice is great, but business and the economy really have to come first.
I think it's a false choice. I mean, we can have a robust and healthy economy and justice too. The problem we have is that the economy is not built to benefit the people. It's built to benefit a privileged few at the expense of the people. So they're presenting us with a false choice.
Last question. Lots and lots of politicians are lawyers. I think how many senators in Congress people down in the States, members of Parliament are lawyers. What sets you apart as a lawyer and a politician?
Well, I think that ultimately the kind of program that we've been discussing tonight and that I've been discussing throughout this campaign is going to encounter ferocious resistance from the billionaire class and big business. And so, and in fact, I would say that if the Green Party members do not ultimately elect a leader who is attracting attacks from the corporate sector, then they've not made the right choice. There's virtually an inevitability that any leader who is truly committed to overcoming the power of the corporate sector and the billionaire class is going to be met with ferocious resistance. And I think that I have had the benefit throughout my career of having dealt with that effectively. It's something that I began to learn in my early years as a lawyer on Wall Street in the firm of Sullivan & Cromwell, how the corporate sector operates, how it bends the legal system to its will, how it influences the political class. And then I switched sides and became a class actions litigator. And over the course of 12 years, took on Canada's largest corporations and recovered $500 million from them for a variety of illegalities. So this is the kind of experience which I think is going to be indispensable to any leader of a political party that is putting forward an egalitarian agenda, which is designed to ensure that we have a sustainable and socially just society.
And all your work is pro bono now. All your legal work is pro bono.
Almost all of it. I did recently agree to take on a class action at the request of a colleague of mine in the class action bar, but I would say 90% or more of my work is pro bono, including, as you mentioned, this wonderful case that I am privileged to be representing you in.
Dimitri Lascaris, it is a pleasure to interview you on Zoom.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to have one of you.
Let us open up the floodgates to questions.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Dimitri. What a wonderful conversation. I just want to remind everybody that we are here at this live event with Dimitri, talking about justice and the rule of law in Canada and internationally. Just a reminder that we are just about 24 hours away from the deadline for you to become members of the Green Party in order to support Dimitri and his candidacy for the Green Party leadership. I will be putting in the short URL where you can do this in a minute, and you can find out more about his program at teamdimitri.ca. Now, Paul Graham and Glenn Michaelchuk have been monitoring the questions on Q&A here on this channel and on Facebook. I'm pleased to say that at any given time, we have somewhere between 65 and 70 people watching this between either Zoom or Facebook. So that's really great. I'm very pleased to see the interest. So I guess I will now hand over to Paul to start the questions off.
Okay, I'm going to provide the questions in the order in which they've been received, as best as we can determine, and we'll just kick this off with a question from Carol in Winnipeg, who wanted to know how voting on the ranked ballot works. Is that something that you want to take on, Dimitri? Explain the system of ranked ballots?
Yeah, you have 8 candidates in the race, and you'll be given the opportunity to decide, rank every single one in order of your preference, from 1 all the way down to 8. You won't be obliged to do that, but you'll be afforded that opportunity. And then, once the ballots, you'll only vote once. Okay, they'll take your ranking. They'll throw it into the hopper with the other votes, and they will, after doing the tabulation, determine who's at the bottom in terms of ranking and strike that person off the list, and then reallocate that person's votes according to, the second and third choices of the persons who placed that person first. And they'll just keep doing that process, striking people off until they end up with an eventual winner, to make it very simple. So the key thing to know is that you only vote once, and you can rank all 8 of the candidates, or if you choose, you can rank fewer of the candidates. Or if you want, you could just pick one. Say, this is the candidate that I want to win, and not even bother disclosing what your other preferences are.
Thanks, Dimitri. Ralph Kreider asks a question relating to existing fossil fuel projects like the LNG project in Wet'suwet'en territory. He asks, will you pull the permits, assuming that you're the Prime Minister? If you were the Prime Minister, would you pull the permits and force CGL to change the pipeline route, or would you go with the status quo?
I would pull the permit. I mean, no doubt about it. Look, in my view, and this is embodied within our Indigenous rights platform, which we just published, the Indigenous peoples have a right of veto. They don't have only the right to be consulted, which is essentially what the Canadian government now accords to them. And even that right is usually flouted, or oftentimes flouted. They're not genuinely consulted. But they should actually have the decision to reject entirely an extractive project on their lands, even in situations where the government has accorded them full consultation in good faith. And so if the Wet'suwet'en people say they don't want that project on their lands, or they want the route to be changed, then I would respect their decision, 100%. And for every Indigenous community across this country, I would respect their decision.
Okay, we have a question from John Wunderlich. John asks, assuming that you agree that we need to decolonize Canadian government institutions like the civil service and the RCMP, what are the first steps necessary to start that process?
Well, not entirely. Decolonization can mean a lot of things. First of all, if we're talking about interactions between the law enforcement community and Indigenous peoples, I think that we should authorize Indigenous communities. I mean, it's really not for us to authorize it. We should simply just recognize that they should police themselves, and that we shouldn't be sending our police forces, those of the federal, provincial governments, municipal governments, into their lands to impose our brand of law enforcement on them. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think we should be defunding the police dramatically. And we've called for a 50% reduction in the funding of the RCMP. We would call for that with respect to all police forces, but the federal government, its jurisdiction does not extend to municipal and provincial police forces. And we think that we are saying that those funds should be reallocated to the social injustices that generally lead to the types of behaviors that we have characterized as criminal. You know, what is causing people to engage in those types of behaviors? By and large, what is causing it is poverty, homelessness, substance abuse, trauma that is not being adequately addressed, mental health issues that are not being effectively treated. So if we are investing in the treatment that is necessary to resolve these issues and providing people with the social supports that they need to avoid falling into poverty and homelessness, then you would see a dramatic reduction in the types of behaviors that the police are currently dealing with. The police are an increasingly militarized method of dealing with the symptoms of social injustice, not with the causes. So I think we need to reimagine how we're going to, help our citizenry to lead productive and lives in accordance with the laws of this country. So that's a very important thing we have to do. Another aspect of decolonization is we need to keep very careful data and ensure that that is publicly available on police brutality. Which communities are being targeted, who is responsible, what actions were taken in order to address the brutality. We don't do that now. There's a slight move in that direction at the level of the RCMP, but fundamentally we don't have transparency into the ways in which law enforcement are targeting racialized groups in this country. And whether or not the law enforcement community is dealing effectively with instances of abuse.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Facebook. Kristen Porter asks, in terms of foreign affairs, I would love to know how Dimitri would manage Canada's relations with China.
So a problem we have with China and with all of our trading partners is that we don't have effective mechanisms in our trade agreements to respond to environmental abuses, human rights abuses, and abuses of workers. So I think this is not a comment, by the way, which I'm directing solely to China. I think it's something that is of universal application. We should be renegotiating all of our trade agreements to authorize us as a country to impose tariffs and other measures, trade measures, on countries that are violating minimum standards of human rights, environmental protection, and worker rights. If we had that kind of an arrangement with, for example, China, then we could deal in some meaningful way. Perhaps our economic leverage would not be sufficient to really influence the behavior of the Chinese government, but we certainly could have some impact and deal in a principled way in situations where we feel the Chinese government or any other government is acting contrary to minimum standards of human rights, environmental protection, and worker rights. With respect to the current impasse that we have with China, surrounding the extradition or requested extradition of a senior executive of Huawei by the American government, I believe that we have been sucked into a dispute that we have absolutely no business being in. This particular executive is accused, as I understand it, of having engaged in fraudulent behavior designed to circumvent American sanctions on Iran. Well, until Trump came along, the International Atomic Energy Agency, right up until the time of the American government's withdrawal, a recent withdrawal from the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran, it certified that Iran was in compliance with the deal. And Trump withdrew from it nonetheless. And so this is the backdrop to this dispute with China. We have basically arrested a Chinese citizen whose freedom is very, very important, obviously, to the Chinese government, in order to advance the Trump administration's efforts to punish Iran and to ensure that the Iranian sanctions are as painful as possible for the government of Iran. But also, this is an attempt to curtail the growth of a major Chinese corporation. And so we've allowed ourselves to be sucked into this mess. I think what we should be doing is we should be negotiating the release of our 2 citizens in China in exchange for the release of their citizen, and let the Americans deal with the Chinese government. We have absolutely no reason to be embroiled in this matter. The justification being given for the arrest of this Chinese citizen, to my mind, doesn't hold water.
Returning a bit to policing, Carol wants to know, Carol Mowat asks, Black Lives Matter has made demands regarding police defunding. What do you think?
Yeah, I already, I did address that in part. Black Lives Matter is calling for a 50% reduction. Black Lives Matter Toronto is calling for a 50% reduction in funding for the Toronto Police. I'm calling for a 50% reduction in funding for the RCMP. So our platform is very much in line with that of Black Lives Matter Toronto. And as I indicated earlier, it's not simply a question of taking the funding away from policing. It's reallocating the funding to social services and supporting persons who are falling into poverty and homelessness, who are not receiving adequate mental health care. That's where the money should be going.
Okay. Gabriel Haythornwaite asks, or says, any left-wing leadership challenge in a party controlled by right-wingers is inevitably a long shot. This does not alone necessarily make this futile, but if you do not win the leadership, what would you see as a political plan B going forward?
Well, I want to address the point about futility. You know, we received last night the fundraising results as of August 31st. All the candidates received, there are 8 candidates in this race. And we are now in second place. We were in second place at the end of July, but we've increased substantially our lead over the 3rd place candidate. We have more than doubled, substantially more than doubled in 1 month, all of the donations we received in the prior 5 months. We have more than doubled the number of donors. Our average donation size has fallen substantially, which means that a lot of people are coming to our campaign, making whatever small donations they can. We are seeing explosive growth in our social media. I've had people from all over the political spectrum, even a conservative today, announce that they were leaving their party and coming to join the Green Party to support our campaign. So I personally, and I think I speak for our campaign team, we actually think we got a great shot to win this thing. So we don't feel at all a sense of futility on our team. And I can tell you right now that a big part of the reason why we're in such a great position to win is because Radhika Desai is the chairperson of my platform committee. So I'll tell you right now. And I couldn't have a better chairperson of my platform committee. And one day I hope to tell the story of how immense a contribution that collection of wonderful human beings has made to the success of this campaign. But in any event, to go, to talk, I forgot the second part of your question. The first part was about futility.
And the second part is plan B.
Plan B.
If you don't win.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I don't win, I certainly would want to continue to advance a progressive agenda, boldly progressive agenda within the Green Party of Canada. And I would hope that, the leader who prevails, if it isn't me, would afford me an opportunity to play some kind of a role, and there are many different roles I could play in helping to advance that kind of agenda. Outside of the Green Party, I mean, that would be certainly my desire, but one way or another, I'm going to continue to be very active in the cause of justice and peace, whether it's through political engagement in the Green Party, whether it's through activism, whether it's through independent journalism. I'm going to devote, whatever contribution I can in that regard. It was what I was doing before I entered this race, and it's what I'll continue to do regardless of the outcome.
Okay, Bill asks, could you provide your definition of eco-socialist? He says, we've seen the socialism term weaponized, especially south of the border. Do you see drawbacks in claiming that mantle? How do you convince Canadians that your definition preempts what many consider a scary term, especially when opponents will use it against you?
So I'm going to cite for the 75th time in this campaign a Forum research poll that was done last year, which showed that 58% of Canadians have a positive view of socialism. And within the Green Party and the NDP, large majorities have both a positive view of socialism and a negative view of capitalism. And even within the Liberal Party, 74% have a positive view of socialism and 45% a negative view of capitalism. So I think, you know, when we talk about the weaponization of the term socialism, I think, you know, we have been led to believe by the corporate media that that embracing socialism openly is a much greater obstacle than it actually is. There is, in fact, broad-based sympathy and support for some social organization and economic organization that can fairly be called socialist. So that's the first thing to acknowledge. You know, beyond that, in terms of what I understand eco-socialism to me, you know, one person who's a very well-known eco-socialist in this country said to me a month ago, you know, nobody has a patent on eco-socialism. So my particular concept of it may not necessarily be someone else's, but I believe that at a minimum it means democratic control of the means of production that are necessary for the well-being of the population. So that doesn't mean all means of production, but the means of production that are necessary for the well-being of the population. And I stress the word democratic. I'm not talking about a top-down hierarchical structure of control, but control at a grassroots level. So for example, we're very, very supportive of the concept of worker cooperatives. We want to facilitate worker cooperatives, both in terms of with training and with financing. So that's one aspect of eco-socialism. Another is we eliminate extreme wealth. And by that I mean wealth that is so substantial that it can actually be deployed to corrupt the democratic process, which is done in this country on a daily basis. Thirdly, the elimination of poverty and homelessness. There should be no poverty or homelessness in a society. And I think that that's a principle that should appeal to anybody, whether you call yourself a socialist or not. And we are, after all, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Fourthly, a society that is truly peaceful, both domestically and on the international stage, fundamentally committed to peace, a society that is fundamentally committed to the rule of law and the equal application of the law, a society that has zero tolerance for racism, both at the micro level and especially on a systemic level, and a society that is fundamentally sustainable, that respects Mother Earth and that has facilitated, you know, our reintegration into the natural processes. We've been divorced, taken away, ripped away from the natural environment. And this is having very negative spiritual impacts on humanity. And we're seeing this in the way, you know, in the mental state of our youth today. I mean, they're so traumatized by what is happening to the planet and the way we've become destructive and heedless of the health of our planet, that we cannot, you know, abandon this destructive system quickly enough. So this is ultimately, you know, the core of what I call eco-socialism. I'm not talking about anything more than that. And I believe that when you explain that to people, it will appeal to a vast majority of Canadians. I think those concepts are something that we can easily inspire Canadians to support.
Okay. We have a question coming from Hal, who says hi from Vancouver Island, and writes, Elizabeth May was our champion against investor-state dispute resolution clauses like NAFTA Chapter 11 and the CCF-IPPA. Trudeau said he would fix it as he voted to keep the signed unratified deal. Mulcair said that he would abrogate this FIPA. What would your stance be on these?
Oh yeah, I mean, we must renegotiate all our trade agreements to get rid of ISDS. I mean, this is ridiculous that we give the corporate sector the power to sue our governments for pursuing policies that are in the public interest. So I would renegotiate all of our trade agreements to eliminate that ability of the corporate sector to sue our governments. I wouldn't limit that approach to any particular trade agreement. I think that has to be a broad-based renegotiation of all our trade agreements to that effect.
Carol Mowat thanks you for answering her previous question and wants to know if you would support the inclusion of UNDRIP in Canadian law.
100%.
Doesn't get any more definitive than that. Philippa Syme asks, how would you as party leader present the Green Party to the great unseen Canadian public as a significant option?
The great unseen Canadian public, I'm interpreting that to mean the millions of Canadians who don't vote but are eligible to do so.
Or at least the millions who aren't watching this broadcast.
Oh.
I only read these things.
Well, I mean, you have to use any and every method available to reach the public. So, we have a robust independent media in this country, which I think our young people particularly, but Canadians generally, are becoming more engaged with. So I spend a lot of time dealing with the independent media, with organizations like the National Observer, the Tyee, Rabble, the Real News Network. So that is a very fruitful avenue whereby we can connect and communicate with Canadians, especially younger Canadians. We have to, I think, get out there in every possible way, whether it be by Zoom call, meet and greets. I've done in myself in the course of this campaign, I think over 50 in-person meet and greets from Vancouver Island all the way to Quebec. I've done more Zoom calls like this than I can count. And I've got another 29 to go before the end of the campaign. So you just have to be tireless about getting out there and speaking to as many people as possible. And you have to be willing to go to small communities. I spent a lot of time in little towns with my co-campaign manager, Matthew Pelosa, has been driving me all over Southern Ontario. And we did something very similar in the Okanagan. We have to go to small communities and actually talk to people and hear from them. It's a lot of work. It never ends. But I think ultimately an inspirational message that speaks to the hearts and minds of Canadians will get out there. And, people, we need to help people to become our spokespersons around the country.
What's your vision for the Green Party? And this is coming from Robert M. He asks, what is your vision of the Green Party as likely permanent opposition party? How can it hold the current government regime to the fire?
Well, I'm not so pessimistic as to think that status would be permanent. I think the goal should be to ultimately form a government. I think that is eminently doable, and I don't think that we should be so quick to assume that opposition will be a permanent status for this party. But it is true we have a lot of work to do to talk about forming a government. So I think, one thing that we have to do, this is a phrase that has been a little bit overused in Canadian politics, but we have to be the conscience of the nation. And that means that we always have to take positions that are principled and defend those positions, and science-based is very important, fact-based, and defend those positions no matter how ferocious the opposition from powerful interests. So we can, using our status as politicians, as elected officials, effectively occupy a bully pulpit through which we communicate what we know to be true and just to our fellow Canadians. I think we also have to nourish relationships with activists on the ground. I often get asked, how are we going to professionalize the party and turn it from being an activist movement into being a real political party? Well, I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive. I think we should do both. So one of the things I liked the best about Elizabeth May's record was when she went to Trans Mountain and got arrested. I thought that was one of her finest moments. And I'd like to see, I certainly intend, I've engaged in acts of peaceful civil disobedience. And if I'm the leader of this party, I'm going to continue to do that. Side by side, shoulder to shoulder with young people of this country, with retirees around the country, whoever wants to get in the streets and peacefully militate for social justice and sustainable society, I will be there. And I think our party as a whole has to be a friend and ally to activists around the country.
Kevin Morse Code asks, what is your strategy for countering the inevitable media campaign against you if you become leader, and possibly in September during the lead up to voting?
Well, is Morse code really your name?
I only read what I get on the screen here.
I know, I'm just joking. Well, look, to paraphrase, you know, a politician who once faced similar type of opposition, I well know wear their hatred as a badge of honor. I mean, if they're coming after me, the people in positions of power and privilege, that means I must be doing something right. And I've, you know, dealt my entire career with those types of attacks. You know, when I was a class actions lawyer back in 2006, I was approached by, I wasn't approached, I actually learned by reading the financial press of an incredibly innovative professor of statistics from the United States who had discovered a methodology or formulated a methodology for detecting a form of fraud known as stock options backdating. And this methodology was applied by the Wall Street Journal to options data of a bunch of major tech companies in the United States. And all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. But nobody was doing anything about it in Canada. So we put together a team of people, and we borrowed the professor's methodology with his guidance and applied that methodology to 1,000 TSX listed companies. And the methodology produced a probability that these companies were engaged in stock options backdating. And at the very top of the list was none other than Research in Motion, which at the time was the darling of the Canadian business community. This is when everybody thought that the BlackBerry was going to become, you know, the principal mode of communication for generations to come. And its co-CEOs, Jim Balsillie and Michael Lazaridis, were literally walking on water in the financial press. And I was retained at that point by a union pension fund, which had about $2 million worth of shares, and instructed to accuse them of stock options backdating, which I did. And they immediately responded by suing me and my law firm for $55 million for defamation. So I went to my client and I said, you know, I believe in the methodology. I'm absolutely convinced that they are in fact engaged in stock options backdating. Will you back me? Will you continue in this lawsuit? And they gave me their full support. And we proceeded to prosecute a derivative action against Research in Motion. And within 6 months, Mr. Balsillie and Mr. Lazaridis paid $10 million out of their own pockets in order to resolve the claims against them. And they withdrew their defamation action against me without me retracting a single word, without me apologizing for one thing that I had said, and without me or my insurers paying a single dime. So I know what the tactics of the corporate community are. I've dealt with them. I'm not afraid to take them on. I'll need your support in doing that. I can't do it alone, but this is not new to me.
John Wunderlich in Toronto has a follow-up question to the discussion about decolonization. And he asks, how do you propose to convince your typical middle-class voter who is proudly Canadian that decolonization is actually a thing? In other words, it's a real thing, and that it's a necessary thing?
Well, I think that most voters in this country actually believe it's a thing. You know, I mean, especially now. Let's look at what was happening around the country before the pandemic hit. You know, there were blockades erupting all over the place in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people. And it wasn't just Indigenous peoples who were participating in those blockades. People from across the country, from various communities, not just the Indigenous community, were putting themselves on the line in order to defend the rights of the Wet'suwet'en people. And so I think that there is obviously work to do in some segments of the voting public, especially those voters who lean to the right. But I don't think we should underestimate the level of consciousness that there is currently about the colonial nature of our government and the horrific impression that Indigenous peoples have suffered. So I think, you know, ultimately, for those who haven't been convinced, we need to constantly talk about the historical treatment of Indigenous peoples in this country. You know, one of the things I did on the campaign trail about a month ago was at the suggestion of Matthew Pelosa, who's on this call, we went and we visited the Woodland Cultural Center on Six Nations, or just next to Six Nations territory outside Brantford, which was the first residential school in Canada and became the blueprint for residential schools around the country. And Janice Montour, the executive director, gave us a tour of the facility. And I'll tell you that even I, who was already persuaded that we had committed a genocide, did not really understand how horrific the treatment of Indigenous children had been until I received that tour of the Woodland, of that former residential school. So we need to get our children, I think we should be taking that should be an absolutely fundamental part of the curriculum of educating our young kids, is to take them into Indigenous communities and to hear from Indigenous peoples about what they have historically suffered. I started at a very young age to engage young people in the process of understanding this horrific injustice, which we all have a duty to address. So I think education is an absolutely critical part of the factor. We have to start very early in life with our young people.
Philip Asime asks, how can Greens get better coverage in the mainstream media, which has frequently discounted the party? Not all Canadians are on social media.
Yeah, true. And some of them, and some of the people on social media are not paying necessarily attention to the right accounts. So we got a lot of work to do. I mean, look, I don't have any illusions about how difficult it is going to be to get a fair shake from the corporate media. And what we call the mainstream media are by and large profit-driven organizations controlled by very powerful people. So we have to have, we have to be realistic about the challenges. But one thing that I think I bring to the table that, a few of the candidates do is I have a very, very extensive profile in the mainstream media. When I was a class actions lawyer, I was routinely quoted by the mainstream media, by the Financial Post, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, on dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of occasions in connection with the work that I was doing as a class actions lawyer. So I think that mainstream journalists in the country have a certain level of comfort with me. They don't necessarily agree with me, and their bosses certainly don't in many cases, but I don't think that they're going to view me as being somebody who is on the fringes of society or who is a utopian dreamer. I think they'll understand that I have, for example, I was nominated by Canadian Business Magazine as one of the 50 most influential people in Canadian business. So that hardly sounds like somebody who's some out of touch radical. So I have that kind of a profile within the mainstream media. But as I said, I understand perfectly well that the kind of platform that I'm putting forward is not one that they're going to be keen to promote. So we have to also look to alternatives like the independent media, like going out in the field and meeting with as many people as possible, including in small communities, helping people around the country to become our spokespersons, to speak on our behalf wherever possible, using the social media in a robust and intelligent way that speaks to the hearts and minds of young Canadians. So there's a lot of things we're going to have to do in order to overcome that resistance within the corporate media, but I think it can be done.
Okay, Rick Marcuse asks, can you comment on your vision for the Greens and the reality of the NDP? For example, what might you say to folks who feel that the NDP is the party of the left and that they feel unable to abandon it?
The NDP that got rid of the word socialism from its charter, is that the NDP we're talking about? So I'm just being facetious, but what I've really set my mind to doing with the help of my fabulous platform committee is putting forward a workers' rights platform that is far beyond anything that any NDP federally or provincially has talked about in the last 30 years, or perhaps in the entire existence of the party. So some of the highlights of our workers' rights platform are a 10-to-1 legislated spread between executive compensation and worker compensation, mandatory representation of workers on the boards of public companies, legislation banning the use of replacement workers in strikes and lockouts, a $20 minimum wage, the prioritization of workers' claims in corporate insolvencies over those of secured creditors, hedge funds and banks and others, so that workers' pensions, for example, are protected in insolvencies to the maximum degree possible. So when I put this platform out, I don't think any of that stuff, or almost any of that stuff, is in the platform of the federal NDP. And so when we issued our workers' rights platform, Sid Ryan, many of you will know, is a fearsome advocate for workers, the former Ontario, the president of the Ontario Federation of Labor, former NDP candidate, came close to actually running for the leadership of the NDP. He endorsed me and unambiguously, and he said that he has not seen a workers' rights platform like this in his lifetime from the federal NDP or any provincial NDP. So this is how we will win the hearts and minds of Canadian workers, is by taking positions, bold positions, in defense of the millions of working Canadians in this country that go far beyond the incrementalism and timidity of both the federal and provincial NDP. And I've seen this. I've seen people come to our campaign and say, you know, I'm a lifelong supporter of the NDP. I'm a member of this union or that union, and I just took it for granted that I should support the NDP. I've ripped up my membership card. I'm joining the Green Party for the first time. That is how we are going to separate ourselves from the NDP. They've made it, frankly, at the level of the leadership of the NDP. And I have the highest regard for the base of the party. My beef is with the leadership of the party. You know, they've made it incredibly easy for us, frankly, to set ourselves apart and to become the champion of Canadian workers and to occupy the left of the political spectrum all by ourselves.
A change of pace. As leader of the Green Party, and this is from Marguerite Warner in Winnipeg, she asks, what are the key moves that you would make to demilitarize Canadian foreign policy?
Well, we're calling for a 50% reduction in military spending to start. And furthermore, we need to get out of NATO. There's absolutely no justification for this country continuing to remain within that belligerent, destabilizing, carbon emission producing military alliance. And so I think that that would go a long way to freeing the Canadian government to pursuing a policy of global demilitarization and being a leader in that regard. So for example, one way in which NATO has prevented us from doing that is that when 60 some odd nations recently concluded a nuclear weapons ban treaty at the United Nations, not only was Canada's government, the Trudeau government, dissuaded by the nuclear powers within NATO from acceding to that treaty, but we actually disgraced ourselves by criticizing the treaty. We criticized the treaty. I think that had a lot to do with pressure from within NATO. We cannot, as long as we're part of that military organization, pursue a truly principled international policy and also a program of demilitarization. Furthermore, I think that we should ban the sale of weapons internationally, outright. But whatever we do, we need to end the sale of weapons to human rights abusers. No more weapons being sold of any kind to the Saudi autocracy. No weapons trade with the state of Israel, with the government of Egypt, with the United States itself, which is one of the most egregious human rights abusers in the post-World War II period, if not the worst. So we need to end arms trade, we need to get out of NATO, and we need to start the process of dramatically reducing our military expenditures, and we need to bring our troops home. And the only situation in which our troops should ever be stationed abroad is if we have a formal declaration of war by Parliament, or there is a UN Security Council sanctioned peacekeeping mission. In all other cases, our troops should be situated here in our own country.
Returning to discussion of Indigenous issues, James Plewick writes, regarding Indigenous platform, I think that the term reconciliation is a word that does not correctly address the relationship between the Indigenous nations and Canada. The proper term should be conciliation. The term reconciliation assumes that there was a harmonious relationship in the past, but that it is broken down and needs to be restored. James says the term conciliation acknowledges that the harmonious relationship was never fully established. The treaties were deemed as cede and surrender, or were simply not honored or that they remain unfinished. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that's very insightful. I hadn't heard that before. I think conciliation is a much more accurate term. Actually, I was contemplating that when you finished the second part of the question. Could you repeat the second part of that question, Paul?
Well, he says that you know, actually there was only one question. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah.
Is conciliation a more accurate way of describing
Yeah.
what needs to be done?
When did our colonial government ever treat Indigenous peoples with a minimum of human decency? I mean, let's be serious. No, I think you're absolutely right. I had never really thought about that. And by the way, let me say something else that I think is really an idea whose time has come. You know, we have the benefit in our campaign of having advice from a traditional teacher from Six Nations, Diane Longboat. And in formulating our Indigenous rights platform, Diane talked to us about a proposal, which I understand is being formulated and by the Assembly of First Nations for Indigenous communities around the country to be entitled to a fixed proportion of our GDP annually, so that they have stable, robust funding and are not obliged to come hat in hand to the federal government or provincial governments for much needed funds in order to address crises within their community, like the crisis of contaminated water. I think that that's an idea whose time has come, and this is something that we've incorporated into our platform. That's conciliation.
Tony Stortini says, hello, Mr. Lascaris. I saw your interview with David Dole, and you mentioned using the Bank of Canada to add currency for green initiatives. I think that's an awesome idea. Does that mean you're in favor of reinstating the pre-1974 Bank of Canada mandate, which I'm strongly in favor of, he adds?
Yes, it does. I'm a proponent of something that's come to be known in some economic circles as modern monetary theory. And, you know, in essence, modern monetary theory posits that a state that has control of its own currency and whose debts are essentially denominated in that currency can never go broke, because all it has to do is generate more currency to service its debt. We as a country have the ability, having control of our own currency, to generate all of the funding necessary at the level of the Bank of Canada to bring poverty to an end, bring homelessness to an end, and effect within the necessary time frame a transition to a renewable energy economy and a zero emission economy. We have that ability, and I as Prime Minister would ensure that we use it to the maximum of our lawful and fiscal ability. You know, the only possible constraint on the use of the Bank of Canada, practically speaking, to generate currency for these socially productive purposes is inflation. But excessive inflation, you know, the economic evidence, I think, establishes that excessive inflation would only be a real risk in a situation where the economy is functioning pretty much at full capacity. And we're nowhere near that, especially now during the pandemic. So this is something we have ample fiscal space to do. And if you haven't heard of MMT before, I suggest you look up Stephanie Kelton, who's an American economist, was an advisor to the campaign of Bernie Sanders. Another great MMT theorist is Professor Steve Keen in Australia. Those are just a couple. Inform yourselves about it, because it is a game changer. If we adopted and embraced MMT in federal government budgeting and in our fiscal and economic policy, we would have transformative changes to the way our economy is organized.
Brian Lessard writes, the vast majority of losses due to COVID-19 falls on the working class that's not protected by unions and entrepreneurs in the service industries. What would you do to mitigate the losses? And why have capital lenders, landlords, and mortgage holders been exempt from the lockdown? Shouldn't those costs be suspended in a lockdown?
Well, if we're talking about essential services, you know, we have as a society to find ways to ensure that those services, for example, our healthcare system, those services are sustained during the pandemic in ways that minimize the risk to frontline workers. And there are many things that we can do from a practical perspective to make sure that they have adequate protective gear, make sure that we develop a vaccine as quickly as possible, that we develop treatment of COVID-19 as quickly as possible, take whatever practical measures we can within the work environment itself to minimize the risk to them. To the extent that workers are being put into the field to deal with things that are non-essential services, I think that that shouldn't happen at all. They should be provided with the economic support necessary to enable them to stay home during the pandemic and to avoid a work environment which is exposing them to elevated risks of contracting the virus. So we haven't done that, and I think we should. So there are a lot of people who are being made to go to work who are not actually, whose labor is not actually necessary for the functioning of essential services within our economy. And the latter part of your question, I believe, dealt with, now I've lost my train of thought about the latter part of your question, Paul.
Well, it was costs related to paying landlords and mortgages and that kind of thing. Right. Shouldn't these be suspended in a lockdown?
Yes. In fact, I called for very early on in the pandemic, within weeks or 2 weeks of the confinement, for a 3-month rent holiday, a legislated rent holiday, and a 3-month interest holiday. And if the confinement had lasted much longer than that, then I would have called for their extension. But I think basically we should have forgiven rent and interest obligations during that period, while providing, there are obviously small landlords who would have been adversely affected by that. So we would have to provide at the same time sufficient support for small landlords to ensure that they remain solvent during the pandemic, during the rent holiday. But some of these larger landlords, that make money hand over fist, they could have sustained those losses and continued to be viable and profitable business enterprises in the long run. And they should have been prepared to assume part of the burden of dealing effectively with the pandemic.
Okay, here's a quick one. Elizabeth Block says, forgive my ignorance, but what is UNDRIP?
The Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Very good, thank you. We have a question from John Wunderlich. I think is it a question or a statement? I'm sorry, John, if you're listening. It's a question about the way in which political parties are collecting and using personal information for targeted advertising in ways that can undermine our democratic process. I haven't seen anything in the platform about digital threats to democracy and the growing surveillance state, both in terms of the public and private domain. So I take that the implied question is, what are your thoughts on surveillance capitalism and perhaps how it's being applied even by political parties, such as our own, the Green Party?
Well, we don't have anything in the platform on this, and it's not a comment on the importance that we attach to it. It's just that we only have so many issues that we can address in the platform, and there are some things we haven't had the opportunity because of the limits of resources and time to turn our thoughts to. I don't want to just shoot from the hip and give you some glib answer because I haven't really thought about this carefully and consulted with the many wonderful people on my team about it. I do think that it is an issue that requires careful consideration, and I am very concerned about the exploitation of personal data by the corporate sector and even by political parties in ways that are contrary to the interests of persons whose data is being employed. So as a general principle, I think it's an important issue, but I'm not going to tell you that I sit here and I have specific policy prescriptions to offer to you because that's just something we haven't focused on yet in our campaign.
Okay, Philip Asime asks, please confirm if your platform includes a formula for post-secondary education. If your party will, under your leadership, I guess would it include dental care as fundamental health care that all Canadian citizens would have access to?
Yes, it would include dental care. Yes, it would include free post-secondary education. We are also calling for the cancellation of all student debt. The current party policy, or at least in the last election, was debt in excess of $10,000 should be canceled. We've gone a little bit further and we've said all student debt should be canceled. In terms of a formula, no, we haven't put one forward, but that is certainly an important issue that would have to be addressed to ensure robust funding for universities.
Okay. Gabriel Haythornwaite has a follow-up question. Writes, thank you for addressing my previous question. What do you see as a genuinely democratic political relationship between Canada and First Nations as opposed to the current autocratic control of the Indian Act and affairs regime? What steps are needed to create this democratic relationship?
Two of them I've talked about already. According to Indigenous communities, an absolute veto over the use of their lands. And secondly, robust and stable funding in the form of a negotiated percentage of GDP being allocated annually to Indigenous communities across the country. I think also the way in which that money is spent should be entirely up to the Indigenous communities themselves. And the ways in which they decide to spend it should be determined according to their own traditional methods of decision making. We should respect those decisions. I think also we need to negotiate and deal with them on a day-to-day basis, Indigenous communities, as sovereign states. So for example, they would be responsible for policing themselves. That's just one element of sovereignty. Another, of course, would be veto over the exploitation of their territories. So broadly speaking, that is how we would, I believe the word that the questioner used was democratize our relationship with Indigenous peoples. I think that those are the fundamental elements of a healthy, democratic, and mutually respectful relationship.
Okay. Questions are coming in thick and fast, and I'm starting to go blind with the screen. So I apologize if I've missed any or gotten them in the wrong order. I guess the next one, we have a question from Mexico. He says, I'm Carlos Sanchez from Mexico. I'd like to ask Dimitri about his thoughts on the Canada-Mexico relationship, especially in the mining industry, because here in Mexico, we have a strong presence of Canadian mining industry, and they mean a pollution problem for many Mexican communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carlos. I'm very impressed to have somebody on the call from Mexico. I was on a Zoom call earlier tonight and had two people from Fresno, California. I was talking to people in Halifax from the Green Party. So somehow our message is getting out beyond the borders, and that's great. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I've talked a lot about this problem, Carlos, and I'll tell you about a case I did when I was a class actions lawyer. It was against a Canadian gold mining company called Nevsun, based in Vancouver. It had one functioning mine, and that was in Eritrea, not in Mexico. It was in Eastern Africa in a deeply repressive state. And there it was using slave labor. And we brought a case against that company on behalf of the workers. And it was extraordinarily difficult to bring that case because we couldn't get into the country to find people who had worked at the mine. And the persons who had managed to escape from the country were scattered all over the Middle East and parts of Europe. So we had to, it's like looking for needles in a haystack, and we went and we talked to them eventually after much effort, got their evidence. And then we came back to Canada with that evidence, and we brought a case before the Canadian courts. And Nevsun said, you know, this was done by our subsidiary over in Eritrea. And therefore, this is a matter for the courts of Eritrea. And furthermore, you can't sue the parent company because we're a separate legal entity. So it is the foreign subsidiary, which of course, didn't have nearly as much assets as the parent company, that is the legally responsible party, and you have to sue in Eritrea. The problem, of course, is that Eritrea's courts were not going to give a meaningful remedy to people who had been used as slave labor at the Canadian gold mine. And so we managed to maintain the case in Canada, but only because we were able to persuade the court that these persons could not get justice in Eritrea. But the case still had a very, very important hurdle to overcome, and that was that we were going to have to deal with the argument that it was the foreign subsidiary, not the parent company, that was responsible. So how does this relate to countries like Mexico? The same problem would arise if you, as a Mexican, were suffering prejudice at the hands of a Canadian mining company. If you wanted to get recourse in Canada, you would be met with the argument that your claim has to be heard by the courts of Mexico and that you have no claim against the parent company, but only the Mexican subsidiary of the company. So one thing that I want to do as leader of this country, if I'm ever accorded that privilege, is to enact a law which gives people, like the people of Mexico, like the people of Eritrea, a direct right of action against the parent company, the Canadian parent company of these mining subsidiaries, for damages, whether arising from human rights abuses, whether arising from the abuse of worker rights, environmental depredation, against the parent company, and oblige the Canadian courts to hear and adjudicate those cases in this country. So I would basically eliminate the obstacles to persons in countries like Mexico coming to Canada and getting justice before the courts of Canada.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time. I know that Dave Kattenberg has a final question for you, but I want to give you two fast questions here so that we can sort of maximize the input from our audience. Al Garland writes, how do you intend to motivate the younger generations to actually vote? They've been absent at the ballot box for years. And then the second question, just so you'll know how to balance out your time, what are your thoughts regarding livable basic income? Those are the last two questions that I'm going to put forward to you.
The last one's easy. I'm fully supportive of a guaranteed livable income. It should be, of course, tied to the cost of living in the community in which the recipient of the GLI lives, and should be adjusted regularly to take into account fluctuations in the cost of living. Subject to those qualifications, I'm fully supportive. The first question, I'm so sorry.
That's quite all right. How do you intend to motivate the younger generation to vote?
Right. Well, what I found in dealing with young voters, two of whom are my children, they're 21 and 22 years old, is that they're fed up with incrementalism. Absolutely fed up with it. They feel a powerful sense of betrayal. They know that a great amount of time has been squandered by politicians like Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper, who talked about pursuing the policies necessary to resolve the climate emergency, but who did little to nothing, and in fact actually took actions that exacerbated the climate emergency. So they know we have very little time left. They feel betrayed, and they're demanding dramatic action. And I think that if we want to motivate young people to support our party and to become engaged in the political process more generally, then we have to put forward a platform that is far beyond the kind of incrementalism and timidity we're seeing from the mainstream political parties. So, you know, and that's precisely what we and our campaign team have endeavored to do. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of support coming in from young Canadians from across the country. There's a group that's formed called Youth for Dimitri. There were, we were very pleasantly surprised to find out that a number of young people at a protest out in the Maritimes were holding up Vote for Dimitri signs. I'm not even sure who these young people were, but we were very grateful to find out they were supporting us. And I think that that's because our platform is you know, so far beyond what the mainstream political class in this country has been prepared to offer, that they finally think they have something to get excited about and to become inspired by. So, you know, but we can very quickly lose their trust if we end up backsliding. Putting forward the platform is just the first step. We actually have to fight tooth and nail for it and not make compromises of principle. I know that I'm fully aware, for those young persons who may be watching, that if you give me your support, you are going to hold my feet to the fire. I expect you to do that. These are not just empty words. We are serious about pursuing this platform tooth and nail.
Well, if I can just interject my comment on that, the platform gets old farts like me kind of excited as well. So old farts for Dimitri. I'm announcing the formation. Anyway, I'm going to hand you back to David. He's got, I think, a wrap-up question and possibly some closing remarks.
Okay.
Well, you know, we're at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time here in Winnipeg, and Dimitri's. Dimitri, where are you at this instant?
I'm in my condo in Montreal.
Brother, I'm gonna let you off the hook with any further question. I'm not gonna ask any more questions.
Oh, thank you.
I'm gonna make a comment. That for anybody who's doesn't really know Dimitri, hasn't listened to Dimitri talk, hasn't heard him respond to questions. He's now been going for 90 minutes answering questions that he's not fielded before. I mean, after months of campaigning, of course, I'm sure he's heard, talked about a lot of this stuff. But you now know just how brilliant and how articulate and clear is Dimitri's mind, and I have no doubt, none whatsoever, that were Dimitri Lascaris to be standing up on the floor of the House of Commons as the leader of one of Canada's federal parties, the other leaders would be quaking in their boots. And Dimitri, I mean, we need a proportional representation system. Like all 8 candidates who are running, all of them are fine, incredible candidates, and I fully anticipate that they're all going to, regardless of the outcome of the leadership, they'll all end up running in their individual ridings, and God willing, inshallah, they'll all get into commons. And you can imagine with a proportional representation system, which the Greens are really promoting, with 15 or 16 Greens and Commons and Dimitri Lascaris as the leader. Oh my heavens, things are going to change. So I'd like to thank you, Dimitri, for your time and energy this evening. And I just want to remind everybody, tomorrow's the last day that you can become a member of the Green Party of Canada. You've seen various links in the course of the evening. I mean, teamdimitri.ca is the easiest. Go to teamdimitri.ca, click on the Take Action link on the top, and right there you'll see where you need to go to become a member of the Green Party of Canada. And I strongly urge you to do so. As Hunter S. Thompson said, as your attorney, I strongly advise you to go do that. Dimitri Lascaris is my attorney, and if he wins the leadership, I'm going to lose my attorney. But I'll be gaining a leader, a national leader. So with that, you want to say anything, final thoughts, Dimitri, before we click end?
Just that it's been a long day. I did 3 of these Zoom calls, but this was by far the most both entertaining and stimulating. I feel like I come away from all of these, and especially this one, a more knowledgeable and a better human being. So I really thank you for your engagement and your incredibly thoughtful questions. And if there are any that come to mind that I haven't adequately addressed or addressed at all, please send me an email at dimitri.lascaris@greenparty.ca. I get a lot of questions by email and other platforms, but I'll do my best to answer before the voting begins later in September. So thank you very much. It's been a privilege to talk to you tonight.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Matthew Pelosa. Thank you, Radhika Desai and Paul Graham. And we haven't heard from Glenn Michaelchuk, but he's been in the background there. Thank you.
I didn't specifically thank all of you, Matthew, Glenn, David, Paul, fantastic moderation, and Radhika, not only for participating in the organization of this thing, but just being a member of my team who's kicking ass. Thank you very much. David, Paul, fantastic moderation, and Radhika, not only for participating in the organization of this thing, but just being a member of my team who's kicking ass. Thank you very much.